I'm really excited to talk to you all today about finding peace in the journey to forgiveness. Forgiveness is a topic that I think has long since been incredibly important and pretty much has been something we've all been taught wrong since its inception. And yet, I think forgiveness is one of the most important things that we can learn and truly embody as a message, as a progression, as a concept in our life in order to move forward and live our best lives individually and as a community. A little bit about me for any of you that have not yet had a chance to work with me. My name is Kira Wackett. I am a licensed professional counselor who is based in Portland, Oregon. I specialize in anxiety, trauma, and eating disorders, which basically means that I work with people on addressing their shame, negative self-talk, fear, anxiety, and really how to communicate with themselves and the world around them in a way so that they can really live their best lives. My focus is really on trying to be as inclusive as possible, to consider how concepts, how ideas apply to all of us with different intersecting identities, experiences, and to take something that can be so specific or so general and apply it to your specific circumstances. As we get started today, I just want to make it a point to note this course or this topic is something that I spend hours working with people on. In fact, I have an entire ebook that is all dedicated to walking you through this process. So in this video, we're really just getting kind of the highlights version. We're getting our feet wet or getting a taste for what this means and helping to think about what can we do now and how does this apply to our lives so that we can get more curious and excited about the work we're going to be doing. So as we start off, I want to think first about what is forgiveness? What does this term mean? Because you heard me say in the beginning, this is something most of us have been taught incorrectly what it means and how to do it. So forgiveness is a deliberate or conscious decision that we make of our own volition to free ourselves from negative self-talk, anger, resentment, sadness, frustration, all of these, what's often deemed negative emotions and thoughts and feelings, so that we can move forward and live a life that is untethered or untied to those painful experiences or those painful people. Forgiveness is given regardless of if somebody asks for it or if we feel they deserve it. We're going to get to this a little bit more in a few minutes, but this key piece here that we want to talk about is forgiveness is a personal process. It's for our own well-being. And obviously we can make sense that sometimes if we are talking about forgiveness as it relates to the self, it's going to look a little bit different because we're the wrongdoer and the person that's going through the process. But what I want you to think about is that forgiveness is really this idea of how can we best give ourselves the opportunity to write our own story rather than having pain or negative experiences write the story for us. I often talk to people about what it means to write each chapter. Who's writing the chapters of our lives? What chapter are we on versus what chapters do we get stuck in? And so when we think about forgiveness, it's really this ability to, if we're on chapter 7, be in chapter 7. To know what happened in chapter 2, to know what happened in chapter 3, and to be in chapter 7, facing forward to chapter 8. Without forgiveness, when we are guided by or led by our pain, we are in chapter 7, but pulled back to chapter 2 over and over and over again. And that cyclical pulling and stuckness is what can lead to a lot of those negative emotions and an increase in shame, self-doubt, loss of connection, anger, sadness, all of those pieces. So I just basically threw a lot at you. What do I mean by all of this? Essentially, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I want you to note that forgiveness is something that we choose to do, that we get to decide when and if we want to do it. It is about ourselves and our process of healing so that we can move forward and untether ourselves from pain, and that it does not have to do anything with the wrongdoer. Now, as forgiveness stands right now, there are two major issues that I see with it. The first of which is kind of the full house mentality, which is what I'm calling it. So I had a baby about 10 and a half months ago. Yeah, she's almost 11 months old. And I mean, if I'm being honest, I probably would have watched this anyways, regardless of her being born. But after she was born, I got into Fuller House and then went back and watched some Full House episodes. And it was interesting because Full House was something that I used to watch a lot as a kid. But going back, I found myself getting so frustrated at the lack of conflict resolution and the ability to sit in discomfort. So the hug it out mentality that's touted on this show and on many other shows like this is this: say you're sorry, say it's okay, hug it out, move on. So we teach kids at a very young age that forgiveness is something that we do just to move forward, that it's done on the spot and because someone else says they're sorry, rather than empowering somebody to say, how did that make you feel? What do you need? And do you want to continue to exist in that pain or that sadness, or do you want to choose to move forward? And giving them the roadmap to really understand and think about that in relation to their own lives. The second issue I see is that we've oftentimes made the primary character the wrongdoer, which again, if we're talking about self-forgiveness, can involve both of us. But it's this idea that we really strip away the belief that this is a personal process and about gaining power rather than losing power. So a couple things here is that forgiveness is not justice. Forgiveness is a moral virtue, so is justice. These two experiences can happen in tandem. They are not the same. So if something happens, somebody does something wrong, maybe let's say I lie to somebody, I hurt their feelings, someone's unfaithful, someone breaks the law, there's a justice component. That justice component might be something in the legal system. That justice component might be the ending of a relationship. It might be the loss of a job. It might be going on academic probation. There can be a consequence. That's the justice part. And that would be a whole nother route to go down. But essentially what we think about here is that justice is kind of the balance act. What this happened, this is kind of the recourse. Forgiveness is separate. Forgiveness is saying, regardless of justice doing its job, not doing its job, whatever justice is, this is about me letting go of this pain. This is about me moving forward, disentangling myself or untethering myself from. And when I say that, I think about the tetherball pole and that stupid ball that we'd all sit at recess and kind of swing back and forth. It's about cutting that so that we are not anchored around and circling all of our experiences and our filters of life through this painful experience. So a couple of things that people say to me. Sometimes they'll say that if I forgive them, it's like saying it never happened. I'd be sweeping things under the rug. It means I'm letting them off the hook. No, none of those things are true. Remember, forgiveness is not justice. It's not sweeping it under the rug. It's saying, I don't want that to be the filter through which the rest of my story is written. It happened. I can accept that. Many things have happened in life. I'm just not going to keep giving this one the front seat in my life anymore. One of the other things that people say is that forgiveness is about having to talk to the person that did something wrong. I don't want to talk to them, or in some cases, it's not safe to communicate with the wrongdoer. And they might say something like, I'm going to lose all my power, or this is about reopening up wounds. It's going to be too painful. I don't want to talk to them. Or what difference is it going to make? This comes up a lot with people when someone is at the end of life stage. So if you have anger towards a parent who, let's say, is getting older and it starts to seem like death is closer in their life, maybe they have a few years left or they're getting really sick. And so there's this whole internal anguish that we go through. Well, the reality is forgiveness never requires us to have a conversation with the wrongdoer. They don't ever have to know because it's not about them. Forgiveness is about saying, again, this thing happened. This person did this, or I did this. This is a part of the story. I can't take that away. And I'm not going to continue to be in that place. I'm going to let go from that. I'm going to stop having conversations in my head to try to make the story different, to try to tell this person off, to be angry or to have energy towards this person or this experience that doesn't serve me anymore. And the wrongdoer never has to know. My cousin was murdered in 2012. I definitely don't think that the justice system can ever make up for somebody taking a life, nor do I think that the life for a life mentality or eye for an eye mentality is okay. And all of those things that happen from the justice side, from responding to those things, none of those things are going to make my cousin come back. None of those things are going to take away what happened, that he was killed, that somebody intentionally did what he did. But I don't have to keep tying myself to that experience. It happened. It was painful. It still has some pain that comes up with it. But if I continue to filter my experience around hate and anger and negativity and sadness, ultimately I'm making that painful experience the guiding post and that other person the guiding post in my narrative. And I don't want to do that with either one of them. Instead, I say this thing happened that was terrible and horrible, and it's never going to feel completely okay. And I want to figure out how to live a life where I can do the best that I can to show up in the values and to make good on what I've learned from that experience and to make the most of my life overall. And then I'd say that the last thing that people say is that forgiveness is about giving your power away. I kind of alluded to that before, but really it's this idea of saying, well, if I forgive them, I don't have any power. That's confusing forgiveness and revenge, and forgiveness and sort of this top-down approach of needing to one-up somebody or have something on them in your back pocket. Now, if any of you are from the Midwest, and I would assume this is any other place, but I'm from Wisconsin, so I can really only speak to that in family dynamics, but it was traditional that you take anything that you can and you put it in your back pocket to play that card later on. So letting something go felt like you were losing your power because we all play with passive-aggressive Uno decks in our hands. So instead, what you say is, no, by playing that game, I'm actually giving my power away because that's a significant amount of energy I'm spending on all these other people to think about how I can take something away from them, cut them out by the knees, do, X, Y, and Z, rather than saying, no, I don't need to invest my time or energy in those things, and I'm going to move forward. I don't like this person, or I don't feel good with this person, or I'm not safe in this dynamic, or my family's not great at communicating. I'm going to choose to do different. There's power in that. There was a time that something was happening with a family member of mine where they were saying terrible things on the phone to me. I'd put it on speaker so my husband could hear because it was one of those moments where you're like, I don't think anyone's going to believe me. Like, this just feels so surreal that no one will believe me unless someone else hears it. And he looked at me and he's like, say something, say something. And I said, the only power I have right now is to not give them my energy in this moment. And then I had to figure out how to not give them my time and energy beyond that moment. And that's hard, but that's power. That's me keeping my power. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what forgiveness is, what it's not, and where we've learned maybe some incorrect information about forgiveness. So again, coming back, summary, forgiveness is our own choice. We choose it when we want to, at the timing that we want to, because it's right for us. And we get to gift that into the world. No one else gets to tell us when and how and if we need to do that. So now if we think about the forgiveness process, forgiveness really breaks down into two pieces. There's grieving and there's healing. I think about this like a wound, which might be a little bit gross for some of you, but if you think about really like a big deep cut or some sort of, gash, you fall off your bike, you skid, you get a bunch of dirt in there. Grieving is like debriding the wound and getting a really good look at what's there. And then healing is do you leave it open to air? Do you wrap it in a bandage? Do you use Neosporin? Do you use petrocarbo? What do you put on it? And how long does it take to really heal up? And then making sure that heals fully so then any future things that happen don't aggravate that existing wound, but become their own thing to clean and take care of. So what that means in the context of forgiveness is we have to grieve. We have to feel that sense of violation. We have to grieve what's been done to us, what's been lost, what's been taken or added into our lives. And we have to learn to let that go. That's the power piece. So we can't rush to healing without cleaning the wound. We know that. Think about it from a medical standpoint. If we don't clean things out, we just stitch everything back together, put Band-Aids on it, all it's going to do is allow an infection to happen underneath. That's what happens when anger, sadness, resentment happens, when we forgive when we're not ready, or we forgive out of expectations outside of us. So instead it's saying, no, I got to clean this. I get to feel all my feelings. If I'm angry, feel angry. If I'm sad, feel sad. If you feel like you've been violated, embrace that. That happened. And then the second part is now you make sure you do what you can to heal. Because if we don't heal and we stay in the grief for too long, what ends up happening is we actually keep that wound open and allow for more things to come on, and it just becomes one bigger and bigger and bigger festering wound. So then in reality, it might be 10, 20 micro incidences that we could work on independently for forgiveness, but instead now it's become this one giant enormous thing and we feel stuck on that. So as you go through this, I really want you to, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the phases of forgiveness or kind of the process overall. But as you go through this, what I want you to think about is everything is a balance. And it doesn't go grief to healing and you stay there. It goes grief to healing to, oh, I have more grief, to, oh, there's deeper grief, to healing, to maybe a step back. It's a back and forth process. But what you kind of see is almost this like here, and then eventually you're kind of moving forward through the process. And when you hit that end point of healing, you start to feel a sense of peace and calm. So there are a few types of forgiveness. Now remember, in the context of today's presentation, we can't get to all of them because this workbook, this course, these things that I do on forgiveness can be hours and hours of time. It's a much deeper construct than what we can cover in about 30 minutes. But the main types of forgiveness are really forgiveness of others, which includes forgiving, giving that forgiveness, and receiving forgiveness. Those are two very different processes and come with their own barriers. There's self-forgiveness, which kind of in some way is about giving and receiving forgiveness. Oftentimes, self-forgiveness can come in tandem with receiving forgiveness from other people, so it can be a little bit more complex. It also can be something that, as we're giving forgiveness to other people, we might notice other shame narratives come up as well. So self-forgiveness kind of comes in parallel with other pieces, but it's also something that is necessary really for healing in general. So most of us that have anxiety, shame, negative self-talk, feel like we lose our confidence, we don't love ourselves, we don't take time for self-care, there's some element of self-forgiveness that has to come into that in order to move forward. And then the third one is called preemptive forgiveness, which basically means creating a foundation for forgiveness in the future. It involves really this concept of radical acceptance, which means things happen outside of our control and we can't change them. We could if we would, we can't. So instead we have to choose how we respond to them and to find our power where we can. So knowing that you're going to hurt people and people are going to hurt you. You're going to mess up, so are they. Sitting there and stewing on it, being surprised by it when it happens, doesn't help you. It's also not about being hypervigilant, constantly being on the lookout for it and just assuming, well, everyone's better without connection. No, it's saying that relationships are not convenient always, and they have so many benefits. They also have things that are difficult about them. One of those things being people are going to get hurt. And so how do you lay a foundation to allow forgiveness to more easily come into that space? I'm starting to get to some of the benefits of forgiveness, but in case you're not sold on why this is really important, I just want to highlight a couple of them. So the first one I mentioned to you before is really about untethering yourself from pain. So I think about that as like that ball, I guess we go like this, that ball that we swing and we hit around that pole and it's stuck over and over and over again. By cutting ourselves off from that, we get the opportunity to move in a different direction. We're not orbiting the pain. It's not the center of our story. We're saying it's a part of the story, but it can be kind of a superfluous detail or a detail that we get to write a new narrative around. We also know that forgiveness has been shown to be one of the primary components that leads to successful long-term relationships. So I have a course that I do on preemptive forgiveness in long-term partnerships and relationships. Now, in reality, this could be for people that are just starting in a relationship. Maybe you are currently unpartnered, but really want to create this dynamic moving forward, or maybe it's a long-term friendship. But the idea behind this is these people that are in our innermost circle for a long period of time, 5, 10, 20, 40, 50, 60 years. The longer we're with somebody, the more likely we're going to experience that wrongdoing. Or again, we will do the wrongdoing. So forgiveness can be a part of your relationship. You have a much greater likelihood for the relationship having success and moving forward in a way that serves both parties. Now, that being said, there are obviously some times where that's not the key. We don't want to continue in relationships. That's perfectly reasonable and acceptable. Instead, what we want to say here is that in these moments where the relationship wants or needs to be preserved, or we choose for that relationship to be preserved, forgiveness is a key ingredient in order to make that happen. And then the final thing is actually some research that we've seen about 10 years ago. It came out where we looked at how when somebody moves through the phases of forgiveness or the true forgiveness process, which we're going to talk about, once they move through that, when it comes to relation to a memory and experience a person, we actually see marked diminishment in anxiety, resentment, anger, trauma symptoms. So maybe somebody that has PTSD or some other trauma-related disorder or symptoms of that. Rumination, which means getting stuck in a loop or thinking about these experiences, or maybe ruminating on a response, what happened, all of these pieces. So when we go through the forgiveness process, we free ourselves up from all of these things. Think about it like if any of you have a smartphone and not if any of you, many of you have a smartphone. If you double tap the home screen and all those windows that have been running in the background show up and you swipe to get rid of them, think about all of these emotions as being background applications that have been running and taking your energy every day. So if you can sweep those out and get rid of those, it's going to make things so much easier overall. Now, we talked about the benefits. We know what forgiveness is. We know some of the components that's involved. Another big thing that we want to think about is, okay, so then what gets in the way? If this is so great, if we know that we can learn how to do this, why does it seem so difficult? Why do we get it wrong? Well, one of the things that's really key is that a lot of us do have this inaccurate understanding of what forgiveness is because we confuse forgiveness with justice. We confuse forgiveness with an absolution of wrongdoing. And many of us have really significant narratives that play a role in that. Oftentimes we overvalue harmony. So making sure everybody else feels good, everything looks fine at our own expense. So we don't think about what we need and feel and want. A lot of times it also has to do with feeling like we should do this or we have to do this rather than we want to do this. And so this comes up quite a bit in terms of external reinforcements or pushing. So being pushed or rushed to forgiveness. So it's not of our own choice. Go back to the kids example. So there's a little kid and another little kid. Let's say this one pushes this one on the playground. And then the other person has to say, it's okay, I'm fine, and move on. Well, they were pushed into that rather than actually thinking about it. And so even though it might be a really micro incident, kids push each other, things happen. Without that, without giving them the space to really think about their feelings and move forward, we're just telling them that they need to do it for everybody else because it would be more convenient for other people if there was no conflict. And so this kind of gets at something that I go much deeper on in terms of my other courses and books, but it's what's called the levels of forgiveness or types of forgiveness. It really basically means what's your motivation for forgiving? And there are 6 of them, kind of working from the outside in. Level 6 is I forgive from an unconditional, I don't need anything. This is about me choosing it. I'm doing it for myself. I'm moving forward. If the other person never changes, never apologizes, that doesn't matter. It's independent of my process. All the way out to level 1, which is doing it out of some form of revenge, or I can only forgive if I get revenge and there's compensation or things like that. The further out you get, there are all of these other motivations that come from the ego brain and our shame, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also external motivations. Big example being religion and beliefs around what your religion tells you you should do versus what you want to do. And it's important to point out that our religion or our cultural beliefs, those are important, especially from more collectivistic cultures where the community or the group at large is the priority. I'm not saying that none of those things are important. What I'm saying is oftentimes we can put that at such a high value that we don't even really think about what it applies and means to us individually. So if your religion really believes in, or your faith or your code, whatever your code is, really promotes that, okay. But get clear on what you also need to be okay with that. How do we make sure that you're a part of that in addition to doing this because of your culture or community? Another big thing that is really a barrier to going through the forgiveness process in full is timing. So this kind of goes along with being pushed or being told you should or you have to forgive. But what's the timing of it? So if you think about the grieving and the healing, do you rush from grief to healing because it would be easier to get done with it? Do you stay in grief for too long? The longer we're there, remember, the more opportunity for things to glob on and it becomes a much bigger wound to heal. So finding that balance is incredibly important. And the most significant barrier ends up becoming shame, which in and of itself is its own probably 8-hour discussion we could have. But shame is essentially the threat to connection and belonging. It means that we are actively facing some sort of threat that says that you are not worthy of connection or connection is not guaranteed for you. Well, all of us need connection. All of us need to belong. Without that connection, we are unable to feel solid and grounded in the world. But many of us have this belief that we're only worthy of connection if fill in the blank. So those ifs, those expectations, those motivations, often coming from sort of external reinforcement or external activation. Maybe it's the people around us, again, just sort of systems and culture at large. Well, if all of that is weighing in on us, that's going to have a pretty significant effect on how we respond to wrongdoings. Do we deserve forgiveness? Can we let ourselves move forward from things that maybe we've done? Can we forgive people, or is that a source of power, or is the only way that we are able to keep connection through these negative emotions? So it's really working through our shame and getting clear on what that is becomes an incredibly important part in the forgiveness process as a whole. Okay, at this point, we've really hit on a lot of the different facets. Remember, this is such a short training, so we can't get at everything in depth, but I promise you, if you look at some of the other resources that I have, especially the ebook that walks you through all of these pieces and is going to go through all of the phases of forgiveness in depth, and as it applies to all the types of forgiveness, you're going to be able to get at this way, way deeper. But what are these phases I keep talking about? I keep saying that forgiveness is this process. We've talked about all these components. What does that actually mean? So ultimately, these steps or these phases go through the grieving and healing process with much more in-depth ideas and understanding. So part one, or phase one, is called the uncover phase. So what it really means is you're uncovering your feelings. You're taking some time to really sit with, what do you think and feel? What do you want and need? How did somebody hurt you, affect you, harm you? What are all of these components that are just sitting there? It's really about going to the core of the apple or the jawbreaker or the onion or whatever terminology you want to use, and just sitting in that for a second. Just getting really clear on, what do I feel? What did I lose? What do I think? What do I want? What do I need? What are all of these different elements? And how are they affecting my life? How is holding on to this story really affecting me? I'm tethered to this experience and I keep circling round and round. Is it affecting me now? Am I holding on to resentment and anger in my marriage that's making every action that I engage in now still connected to that? I'm definitely guilty of that. I've learned that more and more as I've continued in my own therapy process about how a lot of unresolved trauma from when I was a kid was really factoring into the way that I was showing up now in my relationships with some of those same people, but some new people, because I hadn't found forgiveness for these situations. So the pain and the wrongdoing, and I think a lot of the sense of violation that I felt was coming into these other experiences. So then that became the filter. So anytime this small thing might happen, if Jordan would say something that maybe felt dismissive, or if he would forget something that I asked him to do, I would filter it through the lens of basically, you don't matter to anybody, they don't care about you. And I would go down such a shame spiral that what I was feeling was ultimately, maybe Jordan forgot to get bananas and he said he would get them. But I am now 17 chapters behind, back in this other place where I am now sensing all of the pain and wrongdoing that has been happening since then. And now this thing that was just bananas has become this representation for my life as a whole. So in phase one, we start to sit with all of that. We like peel back and then connect the web in some degree. Phase two is then about saying all of this happened and I'm still going to choose forgiveness. You hurt me, you wronged me, or in some cases, if we're talking about the self, I messed up really, really bad. I hurt someone's feelings. I didn't mean to. This was intense. I'm going to choose to forgive myself, or I'm going to choose to forgive this person. That moment right there is where the power comes in. The choice of forgiveness over sitting in that pain. And it is so much harder than you'd think, because we'd know, well, of course, if I can be free from all these feelings, if I can be more excited about my life, if I can move forward, let go, oh, that's amazing. I want to do it. But there's comfort in pain, especially when we've been sitting there for a long time. So giving that up, if that's become a major part of our identity, the person that has been violated in some way, maybe that's how you've gotten connection from other people. It's how you get empathy, sympathy, any of those things. Giving that up is way harder than you think. So many of us get to phase two and we don't choose forgiveness. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we're not ready. Sometimes it doesn't feel right to us. We have a lot of other pieces we have to work through. I'd be willing to wager 99% of the time, forgiveness is the choice that's going to give you the most freedom. That doesn't mean it's right. It means you have to decide what that looks like for you. And again, holding on to somebody hurting you, wronging you, or something happening, you have to really ask yourself, how does that help you be your best self moving forward? Sure, it motivates you to do work. It motivates you to think about things differently. If we think about our country as a whole, wrongdoing really promotes action. And at some point, we have to think about then what's the healing process? How do we move forward the most effective way so that we can have that accountability, have those pieces, but know that then we have to figure out how we move forward to give ourselves the best opportunity to create the world that we want to exist in. Phase 3 is then when we start to cross over into the healing phase. So phase 3 is the work phase. Essentially, here you're doing a lot of I would say the radical acceptance, like we talked about, knowing things happened, I can't control it, stuff has gone on. We build a different narrative, or we reframe the narrative in some ways. So it's things like, can we see the person as a whole person? Can we consider sometimes why that person might have done what they've done, or thought what they've thought, or said what they've said? Not as a way to absolve them, because remember, that's not our goal, but to say, is there a context I could write this that doesn't put me and my pain at the center of their lives or my life? Can I think about all of this in a different way? And especially when we think about things that might have happened with maybe a partner, a really good friend, a parent, a caregiver, our kids, more times than not, people aren't waking up going, how can I make their days harder? How can I hurt them as best as I possibly can? A lot of times when we do things, even though it feels intentional and it feels like people should know better and how come they did it, a lot of times things come without that intention. We associate those two things together because we feel so personally wronged. So how can we do the work to separate all of those pieces too, and to say, Jordan really hurt my feelings when he did that. Jordan doesn't wake up every day thinking about how he can hurt me. And he did. He hurt me. How do I see that he is somebody that cares a lot about me and is trying to do the best that he can? And in this thing, it didn't work out the way I wish it would have. This part can take quite a bit of time. Often when we get to this phase 3, we might also see that we need to go back to phase 1 and phase 2 for a while, because there might be some long harbored resentment and anxieties, or even things not attached to that specific instant we're working on that have globbed on, we have to come back and spend some time with. And then phase 4 is the discover and release phase. So I always think about that as like letting the balloon go and floating out into the world and just saying, okay, I know it's there, but I'm going to give myself permission to let it go at this point, because we've done the work with it. We've sat with it long enough. We've made sense of it. We get it. And now we're going to let go of the suffering. I might get called back to that at some point. Every time that I hear a few different Lady Gaga songs, they pull me back to thinking about my cousin. But they're invitations to go back with a fondness, to think about him. Yeah, to think about the loss, to think about the sadness that he's not here, and to think about how can I integrate him into my daily life. But those invitations are no longer taking me back to anger and pain and sadness, to think about this person that killed him, or what actually happened the day that we lost him. It's a very different, more peaceful sense of longing and sadness. And that's weird to say, but it does come from that standpoint. And I've done this from the micro side of genuinely having to work through the forgiveness process when Jordan forgets to grab bananas, or having to work through the process of forgiving my family, to working with my mom on years of trauma and helping make sense of things that have happened in our lives because of undiagnosed mental health issues and substance use and all of these things, and how it affected my life. But then also learning how to forgive myself for all of the ways that maybe I have micro incidences and big incidences of causing pain. And then scale that all the way up to dealing with something so scary, so hard, so heinous as murder. And I've seen how the forgiveness process can apply to all of these things, and the freedom that comes from being able to work through these 4 phases. So I mentioned this earlier, but going through these 4 phases is the exact process that you go through from the forgiveness of self and forgiveness of others. The difference when we talk about self-forgiveness is it's oftentimes a longer, more iterative process where we need to cycle through these things more and more. Mostly that has to do with the fact that, again, self-forgiveness gets so much more wrapped up in our shame, our negative self-talk, decades of experiences that we're able to call upon, and that globbing on of different experiences. Because I know I've done a lot of little micro things that have hurt people, but it's a lot easier for us in our brain to come and put them all together. And rather than say, I've done some things that are bad, we start to tell ourselves, I am bad. And that really becomes the crux of the issue from the self-forgiveness place. So as you're thinking about, okay, great, Kira, thank you for all this information. One, I need to go do this workbook. I need to walk through all these phases because I'm seeing all these things that are happening. Two, okay, before all that happens, what do I do right now? How do I start this process? What can I do in this moment now that you're getting me thinking, you're bringing that insight, you're giving me these invitations? Well, the first thing that I would ask you to do is to go back and kind of like I talked about, just do a survey of what you're holding on to. I'm even feeling it right now as I'm talking to you. Kind of, I always hold things right in my, what are these, your shoulders? Into my neck. I have TMJ, so it kind of comes all up in here. And I can even feel as I'm talking, noticing some elements, mostly of self-forgiveness that I've been holding on to for a little bit, but even forgiveness of others, forgiveness of things that I actually gave this presentation in a live session. And there were so many tech issues that were beyond my control and beyond the control of other people. But it was so easy to start to feel pulled towards anger and frustration and irritation and sadness because I was getting pulled out of my train of thought. It's how to, my brain wants to say, how could you all not know that that wouldn't work? Which they had no idea. And then also thinking like, Kira, how come you can't fix this? Why does this keep happening? I didn't do anything wrong. Look at all those invitations for pain and for hate and for anger. Instead going, things happen outside of my control. I don't think any one of us would have liked it to go that way. And it went that way. How do we let that go? So I'm noticing even for myself right now, there's, what am I holding on to? What do I have to work through? And then as you think about this, you go, okay, how is holding on to these things serving me? Good, bad, neutral. What does it do for me? What do I get by holding on to it? What do I get by letting go of it? And then start to think, well, what do I need to decide that? What do I need to start letting those things go? And that gives you some clues as to where you're at in terms of maybe your motivations for forgiveness, where you're at in terms of your grieving. Have you really sat with your anger? Or any other emotion. I think anger just might have popped up because of my example I just talked about, and that being kind of the primary emotion around it. And then answer that question of, or I guess fill in the blank, maybe even of holding on to blank does blank for me. I'm going to choose to blank. And that second part is really important. You're going to choose to what? Because that's putting the power and the onus on you. So from an existential perspective, power and freedom, or power and responsibility and freedom, all come in together. So with, what is it, with power comes great responsibility or something like that, or with freedom comes great responsibility. They're basically just taking existential theory. So what you're saying here is, I have the freedom to choose this. And whatever choice I make, there's some responsibility for me around it. So if I choose to not work on forgiveness, if I choose to hold on to this feeling of resentment, if I choose to continue to be this person that I am when I have these feelings, that's my right. And the consequences of that are on me. I'm choosing that. If I choose to go through the forgiveness process and it feels really hard, or I feel upset, or I feel exhausted, or I feel free and I feel empowered, those all come from my choice. Those are consequences of that choice. So getting really clear on everything you're holding on to, how it serves you, and then putting that element of choice around it. And then as you sit with all of those things, you can decide, okay, so now what? What do I want to do? I know what's in front of me. I know what I want to do with it. If I'm choosing forgiveness, what do I need to support me? And if it's working with me, email me. Download my ebook, go to and talk to me about the courses that I have. I'm happy to be there for you in any way I can. If it's finding other processes, there are tons of other resources as well on forgiveness. What I will say is that this process is not something that works best by just getting a ton of different free resources and trying to compile them all together, because the time and energy investment you're going to have to put into that, and often financial, is probably way bigger than if you were to find some sort of dedicated support to move forward. So again, figure out what that looks like for you. Ask yourself what you need to work through these pieces, and show up with some flexible grace. Some days you're going to feel like letting things go, other days not. We've all been existing in a pandemic. We are all over the place. Our brains are constantly on overload, and there are new anticipatory losses, past losses, there's anxiety, there's grief, there's things happening all across the board. Give yourself that permission to be where you are, exactly as you are, and you don't have to have all the answers right now. And maybe, sure, maybe holding on to these things isn't helpful. It doesn't serve me. I'm actually kind of crappy or a bad person, or, whatever labels you're telling yourself. I usually say I'm just pretty bitchy when I do those things. So then you say, okay, and maybe I'm okay with that right now. Maybe the best I have is to acknowledge it, and then I'll come back another day and see if I'm ready to do something with it. So as you go through this next part again and make sense of this whole process, decide what works for you, I just want you to remember that our capacity to forgive people requires us to be vulnerable, which sometimes is really difficult to do, especially when we have shame, because we've worked our whole lives to say, I'm only worthy if, I'm only lovable if. Now here's your performance. Here's what you have to do. And now we're asking you to forgive somebody. We're asking you to just make yourself vulnerable and to say, it's okay, I was hurt, and it's okay, and I'm going to move forward. And sometimes you're going to let those people back in your life, or say, I'm going to let other people in my life. I'm not just going to avoid connection. I'm going to be vulnerable and let more people in. And so knowing that, sometimes that's really, really difficult because we have so much shame that gets deeply entrenched. And so there's no right answer. Choosing to forgive or not choosing to forgive. It's what's best for you in the moment, given what you have. As you go forward, I want you to just remember, if it's me, I'm here for you. If it's someone else, go find them. Find the supports that can walk you through this. Because one of the most difficult things when we are working through any process like this is we get stuck in our own heads. Find somebody that you can tolerate, that you believe in, that you trust, that you like, that you can stand the sight of long enough to do this process so that they can support you. Whether that's a therapist, a coach, however that shows up for you, find that person and give yourself permission to invest in that so that you don't feel like you have to carry all of this on your own. You've been doing it long enough. This giant tower or tether pole, whatever we want to call it, it's grown and grown and grown, and it's time for you to give yourself permission to let that go. However I can be there for you, I am so excited, and I can't wait to go through the next parts of this process with you.